Hi, I'm Michael Hopkins, the editor-in-chief of the MIT Sloan Management Review. Welcome to our very special webcast on sustainability and competitive advantage. For the past 3 years, we here at the Review, along with our knowledge partner, the Boston Consulting Group, have focused a whole study on the ways that sustainability is transforming management, both now and in the future to come. And in doing that, we've asked a slightly different question from the one that often seems to come up when business and sustainability are considered together. Instead of asking, how can business be made more sustainable, an important, very important question, we've turned it around a little bit and tried to ask, how will sustainability pressures of all kinds present business a set of challenges and opportunities that it can capitalize on by working, managing, and competing differently. It doesn't matter, in our view, whether these challenges are environmental or social or increasingly, in the last couple of years, economic. We're looking at sustainability across the wide panoply of impacts that it has on organizations. And we've done so by trying to not only interview executives, both here in the United States, where I'm coming from right now, but across the world, as well as doing surveys of executives, thought leaders, academics, leaders of governmental and nonprofit organizations of all kinds throughout the globe, in order to get a sense. We have a visitor on our webcast that I wasn't expecting. In order to get a sense of how the world at large is thinking anew about sustainability challenges. What we've found is a very fascinating picture of how managers and leaders are thinking about sustainability, how they're thinking wrong about sustainability, and how they should be preparing to act on and manage differently about sustainability threats in the years to come. We have a fabulous panel here today to talk about this subject. Let me introduce our 3 panelists and then talk a moment about the mechanics of how this will work for you who are viewing. Our first panelist is Knut Haanaes, who is the global leader of the Boston Consulting Group's Sustainability Initiative and our knowledge partner in doing the research and a co-author of the report that we've produced that you can find online at our website, the MIT Sloan Management Review site, which is sloanreview.mit.edu. I encourage you to look at that. Knut will be talking a little bit about that survey in just a moment. Welcome, Knut. Glad to have you with us today.
Thank you, Michael. Very happy to be here.
Peter Graf is also with us. Peter is the Chief Sustainability Officer at SAP and is one of the leading lights in the sustainability officers world, largely a fast-growing ecosystem. So we're really thrilled to have Peter with us today. Peter, say hi. It's good to see you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, Michael.
And lastly, we have Peter Senge, who is a professor here at the MIT Sloan School of Management and author of several seminal business books, including The Fifth Discipline and The Necessary Revolution, and one of the leading thinkers in sustainability for the past couple of decades. Peter, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Michael.
We're going to start by trying to talk a little bit about the changes that each of you has seen in how managers and executives are thinking about sustainability in the now as compared with a couple of years ago, and how they might be looking at it in the years ahead. And one way to attack these changes is going to be by kicking it over to you, Knut, for a moment to talk about what we found in our most recent study about sustainability and competitive advantage. What findings would you like to call special attention to at the top of the show? And I'm sure we'll come back to it in the course of this. What did we learn about how sustainability is being acted on and thought about today by leaders and managers?
Thanks, Michael. Let me just spend a couple of minutes talking through some of the points from this year's study. And I think the first one, which is important, is we see business stepping up, and we see business seeing sustainability as a real opportunity. We actually see that despite the downturn, we see that commitments in general to sustainability are increasing. And in particular, we see that they're increasing amongst a particular group of companies that we, in the survey and in the work, called embracers, the embracers of sustainability. And what is particular about this group is that they actually claim to build competitive advantages around strategies related to sustainability. A second point is the global picture. what we see is really truly a global picture, and we actually see that emerging economies and companies from emerging economies are also stepping up. And for many of them, sustainability really looks like a growth opportunity. It's an area where they see new opportunities, and taking sustainability actions actually looks more attractive for, we see in the survey, both growth companies and regions with high growth.
Give us a quick sense before I move on to the next. You talked about the embracers, the companies that appear to have more aggressively adopted sustainability-related actions. How were they defined, and how big a cohort of the whole are they? Give us a sense of how many embracers there are and how many non-embracers there are.
Yeah, it's a big group. It's a group of almost 50%. Mm-hmm. They are building business cases in the area of sustainability. They are actively linking it to their strategies, and in a sense, they're mainstreaming sustainability into their business. Mm-hmm. And we see them in all regions. Would
you have expected that 2 years ago, a couple of years ago, we would have seen a significantly smaller cohort? What do you think?
I think we're surprised by it, and we actually see it not only across geographies, we see it also across industries. And I guess one surprise is that in addition to the sort of raw materials, energy near industries, we also see them in service industries, etc., where we really haven't seen them before. Mm-hmm. So I think we're surprised by the extent of it.
Peter Graf, what would you point out for us as having changed most significantly over the last couple of years in how executives and leaders are thinking about and acting on sustainability challenges?
So, Michael, as you know, we do business software. We have customers in all industries. So I have the pleasure of talking to people who come from very, very different backgrounds. And I think the biggest shift that we're seeing is moving from risk to opportunity. Mm-hmm. I think that's the prevailing kind of mindset. And I think that also explains why there's more and more chief sustainability officers coming around, because what companies try to do is to tie sustainability to the way how the company creates value. Mm-hmm. So this is not something that happens in some department somewhere. For a software company, it happens in the software development organization. For an oil and gas company, it happens in the refinery. It happens where the company intrinsically creates the value. And that's a big shift. And we go from talking about it in nice reports and marketing brochures to embedding it into the main business processes to drive the value of the business. Mm-hmm. I also think the precursor to that was a better understanding of the business case. Companies used to think in terms of compliance or brand reputational risk. Now they're thinking about saving a lot of money by becoming more resource efficient, or capturing new markets by being able to deliver new products. Mm-hmm. So because of these things, the biggest change for me as a software executive is it became a software market. And that's already a good sign when you can provide standard software to support some of those scenarios that I just talked about.
I'm sure, before I kick it to Peter Senge, let me just follow up with one question. You have talked about, have painted an optimistic picture about a lot of companies that are embracing and embedding sustainability throughout the way they think about competing and managing. But not all companies do that, obviously. Still, a very large cohort doesn't. What would you say the fraction is, those who do and those who don't, if you had to be reductive?
Yeah, I have a little bit more of a pessimistic view, but who's going to doubt your research, Knut? I see there's companies who go about things more tactically. Mm. So who wouldn't try to save energy if energy is a major part of your cost? And obviously it has a positive impact on both your bottom line and the environment. But if it's really about thinking strategically about it. So if you're Nike, sustainability for you means ensuring your value chain obeys human rights, because if they don't, it hits your brand. If you're Coke, you're dealing with water scarcity because you need to water the sugar cane that puts the sugar into the Coke. So it comes to a strategic level, and I think there's very few companies who are there. Most of them go about it tactically. And those who do not drive any competitive advantage are those who wait for compliance as a driver.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Peter Senge. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Let me just say, Peter, that I fully agree with you. I mean, what is the real number of true embracers, the companies that truly build advantages? So self-reported, it's about 25%. In reality, if you look at sort of the real performance, I think you're absolutely right, Peter. But I think still, our work shows something about the tendency. It shows something about the mainstreaming, and it also, as you explained, it shows something about this being an area where we are not only addressing risks, but really seeing opportunities. So
Peter,
I agree with you.
Peter, Senge, two questions for you then. One is, I'm curious to know what you would identify as the biggest change you've observed over the last couple of years and how managers behave. But I also would love to hear you react to what sounds like a fairly comparatively rosy picture of how managers and organizations are behaving. Would you agree that that's accurate, or do you think differently?
Well, there's two ways to look at rosiness. First is relative to what business did in the past. The second is relative to what's needed. I mean, the only really grounded assessment, I would say, is the latter. It's relative to what's needed. And that's very, very hard to answer. And that's not kind of where most businesses are starting off. But, if you start from either a social or environmental point of view, I think you can make pretty strong arguments that we need change, 10 times as fast as we see today in order to avert significant social and environmental breakdowns. That's not a natural perspective for business to take, so I understand that that's not the way we normally assess it. But, we're losing the oceans. That's not a trivial statement, and I don't think it's an alarmist statement. National Geographic has said we have till 2020 to save 20% of the oceans. It may very well turn out that the consequences of burning fossil fuels are even bigger for the acidification of the oceans than the destabilization of climate. You lose your coral reefs, you lose your fisheries. Not only do you lose immense economic and necessary sources of protein and economic value, you lose a huge swath of critical ecosystems. And I think you can make very similar arguments on the social side. The World Health Organization estimates that by 2030, we may have 4 to 5 billion people without access to clean drinking water. It's now about 1 billion today. And somewhere between now and then, say 2020, that figure could be 3 billion. I don't know about you, but I don't particularly want to live in a world with 3 billion people who don't have access to clean drinking water. There's many definitions of poverty, almost all of which are pretty arbitrary. But if you don't have access to clean drinking water, that'll be an absolute definition of poverty. So I think there's two perspectives on this, and I think one is very hard for business to embrace because it really requires looking at the whole of these larger systems and then coming back in to the reality of your business. And I think that's also a way to define the real leaders. Again, not judging them by relative to what people have done in the past, which in truth has been virtually trivial, but judging by relative to what's needed. I think you're gradually finding a small, and I would say the number is probably much smaller than what we've heard, probably well less than 5% of executives who really grasp the depth and breadth of changes needed. And I agree completely with the way both Knut and Peter were framing it. We all know that what activates business is seeing the space for opportunity. If you step back and think about business in terms of society, the fundamental function, I believe, business plays is innovation, even beyond wealth generation. I think wealth generation is a consequence of creating new sources of value. So businesses get engaged in a totally different way when they see huge opportunity spaces opening up and the real possibility for innovation. So I agree completely with what both Knut and Peter said on that front. And I think we're just at the beginning of recognizing just how big these opportunity spaces are, because we still have not really wrapped our arms around how deep and severe the problems are.
And so the change question, I'm going to come back to some of what you just said, but I want to make sure I capture from you, Peter, what you observe as the largest change in how managers and organizations are behaving now. Recent change.
Well, I would say there's a few companies that are really starting to see the potential for revitalizing their business or vitalizing their business.
Mm-hmm.
And probably even more important, a few industries. It's understandable that industries would be waking up at different speeds because they're in different proximity. They sit in different proximity relative to the most intense problems. You know, you could say, for example, that water is the most acute problem in the world today, and prospectively could be the biggest issue in the world over the next 1 to 2 decades. If you're in the agriculture business, you're very close to water.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, although only a few are starting to recognize it, if you're in the energy business, you're very close to water. So I think that the food industry is probably the first one that's starting to see the wake up, you might say, emanating from different places. It needs to emanate from very knowledgeable executives in the industry. It also needs to emanate from our customers. More and more people are very concerned about the quality and ingredients in the food they eat. The Europeans have been for a long time, so it's not surprising. Most of the innovations in the food industry started in Europe. But it's even starting now to come from the U.S., although for somewhat different reasons. It's still the biggest industry in the world. Food production, agriculture, employs more people than any other industry. So I think, well, that's the next thing to watch for, is certain industries that really start to shift at fundamental levels in the industry as a whole. I'm not sure which will be next. Software is a big, interesting question because it's not an industry I know very well, but I mention it because the other Peter is here. I hadn't seen too much going on in the software industry yet, but I'm very intrigued by what you say. I've always thought, you know, one of the big game changers, what if people wake up and say, well, the internet, which is already probably taking 10% of our electricity load in the world, if you consider all the devices, not just the server farms, probably 10% is quite conservative, and growing, of course, very rapidly, doubling every 3-4 years worldwide. What if the internet ran entirely on non-carbon-based sources of energy? That would be a kind of an example of a fundamental shift in mindset. We need that in key industries. Food, maybe software and computing and electronics, I don't know. I don't see it coming yet at the deep level in the manufacturing sectors, because mostly the manufacturing sectors are in that let's be less bad mode, right? We got to reduce our carbon footprint. We got to use less energy. We got to manage our risks differently. All the things that Peter and Knut were saying, that's mainly the driving forces in most of the manufacturing industries so far. It's only when you say we need a new product, a fundamentally different product, we need a fundamentally different business model, that the space for innovation starts to open up, because it's not about doing things more efficiently. It's about doing things differently.
Yeah. I want to come to you, Peter Graf, in a moment to follow up on some of what Peter Senge has just said. But I want to do it by characterizing what I see often as a response to just the kind of thing you've said, Peter, from executives that we talk to. You define a problem that is immense. You know, the needs are enormously large, and we're not doing enough to meet them. And that can have two interesting effects on executives you talk to. One is, frankly, it can feel enormously demotivating. This is too large for me to affect. What do I do? This is what problem is it of mine? I've got to make my quarter.
Yeah, we're not here to solve world hunger.
Right. So that's one effect. On the other hand, could you also argue that the scope of the problem, if all of those challenges, oceans, food, water, energy, poverty, all the things you described, are ramping up fast, does that present, oddly enough, more opportunities for companies, partly because of the innovation space you described, partly because, frankly, companies are going to be faced with different kinds of risk, more egregious risk than they faced in the past, different kinds of threats, and the truth is some companies will do that a lot better than others, and in doing it better, they get advantage. So I wonder, so I want to come to you, Peter Graf, and have you respond to what Peter Senge said and see, when you listen to him, are you demotivated?
No, not at all. I just, there are two approaches you can take, and one is selling a life insurance, and the other one is, which is a conversation about probability, or having a conversation that doesn't include any probability. You will buy energy tomorrow. You will need water tomorrow. And then it's a question about having an emotional conversation, which is very, very important inside of your company. But as we are trying to make the business case to sell our software for companies to run more energy efficiently, to use water more intelligently, to reach out and innovate, to drive social benefits for the communities in which companies operate. When we do that, it's purely a financial conversation because that's the only thing you can actually easily multiply and how you can compete with other investments a company could make. So the biggest misunderstanding in management is that when people start talking about sustainability, is that we want to go from a business argument to an emotional argument. And that's not true. I think that's the biggest mistake someone can make. When we brought this up in the board of SAP and had them approve a comprehensive strategy in a meeting that was relatively short for the amount of investment they discussed, that is a conversation that's purely logical and trying to tie what we can innovate, so I like that term very much, to how we can drive more value for our business. So it's really about taking a broader view. How do we embrace social, environmental, and economic impact in the way how we drive value? The big misunderstanding for many people that I talk to is they still think that what happens environmentally or socially is unrelated to their business success. And what they hugely underestimate is the impact of consumers and those 500 million people on Facebook, and that number blows my mind every time I say it, underestimate how many people are watching. I mean, there is an oil spill and they put a camera on it, not to show the oil spilling, they show so they can prove, well, they have stopped the spill. I mean, that's how far we've come. Yeah. And I think that's where many people still underestimate that, and it's so hard to put a number next to these kind of things. You know, what is the risk there for those people watching? But when it hits you hard. But it's a tough argument to make because everyone says, well, I'm not going to spill any ocean. Yeah. But they will all need to refine that fuel and so forth. So it's very interesting how that resonates in the boardroom. But the first place where it has to resonate is the boardroom. And that's why having a C-level person driving this is important.
Peter Senge, listening to Peter Graf, I'm wondering, you've obviously talked to and consulted with and helped many, many companies, many organizations, many executives. How do you take what you've described and frame it for them in a way that feels actionable and competitively attractive to them?
Well, probably not too differently than what Peter Graf was describing. I guess the way I would summarize that first point he was making is that this is an intensely emotional conversation, and it needs to be a brutally logical conversation. We need to be really good at moving between those two, because what energizes any person, what energizes any organization ultimately is passion, is excitement. I mean, we can talk about innovation till the cows come home, but some companies are really good at it and some are really poor. It starts with something people are passionate about. It doesn't end with that, though, of course. You know, Peter Drucker used to write about the discipline of innovation, and he really believed, I think is one of the points that a lot of people didn't study his work nearly closely enough, that it really was a discipline. But like any artistic discipline, it starts with that spark of imagination and that passion. But then there's the ability to really think through, you know, how are you going to create value? Who does want to buy it? And of course, if you're doing something really new, how do you test the waters in emerging new markets in a sensible way? Because you can't figure this all out from market research. That's, I think, a recurring learning. That if you keep asking the kind of traditional market research sort of questions, you'll get a very backward-looking perspective. This has killed the American auto industry for years. I mean, I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where people have said, oh, well, our focus groups say price of gasoline doesn't matter to the American consumer. Well, it's just so ridiculous. They were saying at the same time when the Prius was taking off, and you realize that in many ways, buying a car, of course, is an emotional decision for a consumer. They want to feel like they're doing the right thing. In any event, so I think that it is intensely emotional and has to be brutally logical, and it's in that nexus, that interaction of those two, that the real innovators will emerge.
Peter, you wanted to follow up,
Yeah, as the proud driver of a Nissan Leaf powered by 100% renewable energy, I want to react to that. We talked about embraces before, and I think it's important that when you're embracing, you have a sound strategy that involves your own company and the way how you create value downstream for your customers. And it's essential because when you say we're all having these conversations, we're doing market research, we're figuring things out. For SAP, it was very clear that if we go that route and we invest so much money in developing software for sustainability, we ourselves have to try to become a more sustainable company in order to learn what it takes to go through this transformation.
Right.
And I put the URL on the whiteboard behind me, sapsustainabilityreport.com. What we do is, for example, internally, we have a very clear strategy to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions back to the level of 2000, where we had 24,000 employees, by the year 2020, when we believe we have something more like 65, 70,000 employees. And in the first 4 years, we managed to reduce 25%, and we save 170 million euros compared to the business as usual case. 170 million euros. That allows us now to actually source 50%, round about 50% of our electricity from renewable sources. And so these are the kind of things where you have to kind of transform yourself in order to be credible in the market and to learn what it takes to do the things you have to do.
Yeah, that latter.
We're all in a learning phase here. We're all in a learning curve.
That latter point is interesting. I think people often talk about credibility. They don't often talk about needing to be at the rock face doing the learning in order to innovate the way they need to innovate.
Yes.
Peter, Senge, when you try to match, intense emotion with brutal logic in the face of a C-level person, a board, whatever, I'm curious, what pushback do you experience?
Well, I think it's a very idiosyncratic conversation, because it's a deep and challenging conversation. Another way to say that is it's going to be a little different for everybody.
Yeah.
It's going to be a little different for every organization. I don't know what Peter Graf's reflections are on this, but since SAP is obviously very seriously engaged themselves, one of the things you're always looking for is how does this connect to our sense of who we are? Mm-hmm. Now, I think that's true of any fundamental strategic shift where, an organization is in some sense impelled to think and act differently in the world because its context, its environment is changing so dramatically. But that's easy to say, but it's like, who are we to do that? Mm-hmm. And my experience is that that's the key connection. What is it about who we are and who we have been? Our kind of core identity images, our sense of our essential competence, what makes us a kind of organization that I really love to work at? What am I most proud of? You can take any of those kind of questions, mm-hmm. which are questions to help people reflect on their deepest sense of affiliation or affinity for an organization. And how does that help us create a unique opportunity for ourselves and our people we serve? Mm-hmm. What's the connection of who we are to what's really needed? At Nike helped us found the sustainability consortium that we established in 1999. It really came down to innovation because that's their kind of pulse. They are a product creating company. They are a market perceiving company. Once they could start to see the space for innovation opening up by eliminating glues in athletic shoes, so you didn't have the real toxic problem of solvents in all the glues, and starting to stitch the upper of a shoe to its lower in a world-class athletic shoes might seem mundane to us, but it's like that's their craft. Now, they don't make it. They have to design it, and they have to market it, and they have to find if there is a market. For them, that was the key. They could see that they could create a whole new range of products. And, you go on their website now, it says zero waste, zero toxicity, complete closed-loop manufacture by 2020. I was on the phone this morning with Paul Pullman, the CEO of Unilever. Same thing. He's now seeing a tremendous energizing of the corporation after 15 years of being on the journey. It's not overnight. But it's also connecting them much more with their deepest sense of who they are. So that's why the conversation is always going to be a little idiosyncratic. And at some level, as I said, it has to have an emotional underpinning, and then it has to have an opportunity face to it.
I want to try to pull together a couple of questions here that came from viewers, and they're all about one topic, and they relate to both the brutal logic Well, they relate more to the brutal logic, to be blunt. They've come in about measuring things, and as you know, the world is increasingly able to measure all kinds of things with technology gains and sensor capabilities, et cetera. And it's interesting that the questions that come in related to sustainability about measuring fall into two kind of camps. So I'm going to be curious to see what each of you guys say about these. One has to do with measuring impacts. Everybody's talking about measuring carbon footprint, measuring social effects, measuring energy depletion, that kind of measuring, which we're increasingly capable of doing and can be reflected in all kinds of ways in organizations that might enable better decision making. That's impacts. But the other piece has to do with performance and the links to value creation inside an organization. Measuring gains in employee productivity, for instance, or gains that are going to enable different sorts of performance improvements that are able to be tied as part of the business case to value creation in ways that make it turn sustainability-related initiatives into compelling investments. So I'm curious to know whether, and I'm very happy to have Knut back on the line. I'm sorry we lost you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be back on.
I'm very curious to hear each of you talk a little bit about whether or not, frankly, you see the gains in measuring. Peter Graf, I'm going to start with you because you guys do so much to enable companies to work with measurement. Are you seeing the gains in measuring as being especially valuable now, in the future, or do you think it's not a very consequential set of changes? Peter Graf, let me start with you.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I think that we had a kind of a culture of trying to measure things to make a great report out of it. The measurement needs to be much more important internally in the boardroom than it is to the outside world. So that's a very, very important aspect of measuring. Because when you do that, you'll start measuring things that really matter. And by the way, they are hugely different depending on what business you are in. So the measurements in a consumer product company is fundamentally different from what you would measure at an airline or something like that, or a car manufacturer. The essence of measuring and the problem of sustainability many times is that people need to make some investment to measure, and they need to do a leap of faith. They need to believe that from that measurement they will be able to draw conclusions that help them improve their performance. So the first hurdle that we usually need to get over is to help people understand that 99.9% of the companies that start looking at energy consumption actually derive energy savings from that measurement. And energy is here just one example. You can do the same with attrition, diversity in your workforce, accidents in your production sites, and what have you. So the measurement element is absolutely critical, but measuring impact and performance are two fundamentally different things, because at least the way I think about it. Measuring performance is how do these things relate to your business results as a company? And measuring impact for me always is how do my results, how do what I produce help other people with their results? So, for example, if you're a Cisco and you produce telepresence, you have a greenhouse gas footprint. But if you look at what your telepresence systems can do in avoiding air travel, your own footprint is minute compared to the impact it can have. And that's a view that helps a lot of companies go and be better prepared to have the conversation internally as well as with their customers, because now it's not only about looking at how you operate yourself, but you're including the entire value chain. Specifically, you're including your customers in the conversation, and that's when it becomes strategic. By the way, we had a lot of conversation about the boardroom. For me, the biggest challenge is not just measure for the boardroom, but measure in a way that it makes sense to the individual in the business. What is my footprint as an SAP employee? How much have I flown? How much have I driven? How much have I eaten? How much have I done these things, and what's the impact of that? That's the only way to really get to a, excuse the pun, sustainable change and change strategy.
Peter, Senge, let me come to you. Have you seen a changed appetite for measuring as a way to either understand impact better and, perhaps more importantly, even link performance to value creation?
Yeah, I think you see kind of a progression from the former towards the latter in very understandable ways. You don't want to forget the former along the way. You know, the wave of which, you know, I've never been a big fan of, all the reports, right? You know, they're an attempt to have a bunch of impact measures and present this in your, quote, sustainability report. And I think, you know, there's a very interesting direct parallel here. As you were first asking the question, it was occurring to me, well, you know, we have financial accounting and we have managerial accounting. There really are two very different traditions. Financial accounting is an accounting measurement process for the benefit of key external stakeholders. Traditionally, of course, in the last 100 years or so, those have been increasingly exclusively shareholders. But that's obviously legitimate. Legitimate need of an enterprise. The problem has come, and I like Peter Graf's comment there at the very end. You can't manage a business based on profitability. To manage a business, you've got to have meaningful set of measures of how the business is operating. You've got to be able to really look at key processes that you understand relate in particular ways to your ability to create value and really track how you're doing. And, you know, like a sports team coach trying to manage the football team on the field, the soccer team by looking at the score on the scoreboard. It's crazy. You know, you have to have some idea of what's going on in the field of action. And I think that's been a big problem in business in general, and probably exacerbated by the shareholder revolt of the last 20 years, that you have more and more boards trying to manage a business by looking at indicators that were designed for external stakeholders. Now, I think you can just take that and extend it. So, yes, we need impact measures because the stakeholders today are not just our investors, they're the NGOs that watch us. Increasingly, they're a broad array of that, you know, 500,000 people on Facebook, 500 million people on Facebook that Peter Graf mentioned. People who are looking at organizations as representing diverse external stakeholders. But all of that will not get you very far if you don't have a way to manage the business. I mentioned Unilever a minute ago. I had a great conversation with some people in the Philippines who've been in Unilever for over a decade, you know, frontline managers in business units. And they said they've seen a huge change in the last 2 years. And they said, we've been talking about all these issues for over a decade. It's absolutely true. Unilever's been a real activist around sustainable fishing and water and agriculture for a long time. Helped create the Marine Stewardship Council to certify sustainably produced fish with World Wildlife back in 2000. But they said only in the last 2 years do we have a meaningful set of indicators that go into every one of our KPIs. So for each of us, when we're putting together business plans, we're assessing the health of our business, we have KPIs, we have key performance indicators that are economic, social, and environmental, and meaningful at the level of gradation of our business. Now they said things are changing, and they're changing at the front lines, which is exactly what Peter said. It's not enough. It's important, of course, but it's not nearly enough to have your board on board. So what? You know, it's the people managing the business. It's the frontline managers, and all the way up that hierarchy that really matter. And that's the world of management accounting, not financial or external stakeholder accounting. So we need both. And, of course, you don't want to lose track of the impact.
Let me, I've got more questions that I've been handed here, so I'm going to change it up a little bit. And see, Knut, I'll come to you and bring you back into the conversation here in a moment. Let me see if I can sum up a couple different questions in one. You've talked a lot about forces that are going to be major disruptors, and I'm wondering if you, each of you, could identify which forces do you think companies are going to be most having to deal with? Sustainability-related forces of whatever kind, whether it's social unrest or environmental challenges or resource scarcities or risk factors. I'm curious what each of you would say if pressed to answer the question, what's the disruptor I'm going to have to pay attention to most in the years ahead? Knut, let me start with you. Okay. What do you think?
Yeah, well, it depends a bit on what we mean with the question disruptors. I think I see a couple of trends that are really important in terms of driving an increased focus on sustainability in business and outside of business as well. So one obvious one is, of course, sort of access to resources, energy prices, commodity scarcity, etc. And that's obvious. It's going to drive an increased focus on sustainability, and it's going to give real returns. Another one, which I think is more interesting because it's less obvious, is really the let's say next generation management. What I see inside the BCG, but I see that in clients as well, is that the next generation is much more willing to embrace sustainability individually, but also as a solution for the company. If it's video conferencing, telecommuting, sharing offices, substituting travel for other ways of communicating, etc. I think sometimes when I think about sustainability in companies, I think that let's say our generation is the problem. It's going to be a lot more, it's going to change very rapidly in the 20 years coming, I think. And to me, that is a really interesting aspect of, which is reinforcing the drive for sustainability.
So are you saying that as an executive, not of that generation, who might be listening, one might want to anticipate, be prepared for almost internal pressure, pressure from your own organization, your own employees, or potentially people you'd like to hire to behave differently. Is that fair enough?
Yeah, I would even say have a look at their children and be brave. I think companies can learn from the young people because they're interested in finding much more radical solutions than what we find in companies today, and companies can gain advantages from that.
Peter Graf, what if you had to be general and reductive, what would you suggest is going to be the biggest disruptor, sustainability related, that companies are going to have to cope with?
Yeah, I guess I have the same answer as Knut, but I can add some data behind it. The most important transition that I see in comparison to, let's say, the 90s is not that prices for commodities go up. The prices go up, but that you can explain with inflation and other things, at least partly. But the real problem for businesses is the extreme volatility of the prices, because it makes your business very unpredictable. The energy or the price of oil can kill or make your margin as a business. And that's really what's the true problem here. As a company who has always managed resources in SAP, human resources, financial resources, capacities in production lines, and so forth, we think we are in a good position to go and collect more data along the business processes and make that available for people to get more visibility and to give people the opportunity to go and optimize the use of those resources, not just in one company, but along the value chain. So resource price volatility for me is the big trigger. On employability, we've done some interesting research at SAP. We do an employee survey annually, and we found out that 80% of our employees believe sustainability is important to the company. 80, that's a lot. 50% believe that they understand the strategy that we have. 50% say they can actually explain the strategy, and 48% claim they execute on the strategy and contribute to SAP sustainability. Now, that's very optimistic, but the surprises come when you drill down. So, for example, below 30 and above 50 years of age, there's a significantly higher likelihood that people believe sustainability is important. Women, unfortunately, believe they are 5% less qualified of explaining the strategy to other employees, but they usually do the best job. They're very effective when they do it. And what I found interesting is that sustainability, to my big surprise, was rated higher, more important in the Americas as compared to Europe and Asia. So what I'm saying is data can change the game, because now we know what campaigns we need to run inside the company, and we're asking questions why, for example, those above 50, do they hear it at the dinner table, or do they just have enough wealth so they don't need to care about the more basic things in life and they can go for a purpose? I don't know what it is, but that's what I see. As you said, Knut, price volatility, employability.
Great. Peter, Senge, okay, so now we'll put you at the cocktail party and say somebody comes up and says one thing. What's the disruptor? What's the thing I've got to be prepared for, on the lookout for, examining in the next couple of years that are going to change how my business is going to need to work?
Well, I would say the voice of the voiceless. So I was thinking about what Knut and Peter were saying, and it seems to me there's a thread there, and it's very understandable. When you're dealing with times of profound change, very often the real leadership comes from the periphery. I think it's a very useful principle to keep reminding ourselves of. Our companies and our societies, they're mirrors of one another, are very homogeneous if you look at them more closely from the standpoint of age and social background. They might be diverse in terms of nationalities even, but even then you find people who've had similar educational opportunities. When you said, listen to the children, I couldn't agree more. I think a lot of the leadership for this field will come from youth and even children. And I say that in part because we have a lot of projects in schools, and you can really see that a real shift in thinking about what a school is starts to occur when people look at the students as leaders for change in their community. And we see that in a lot of places. But then I would also say it could be, now this is a big question mark because the demographics are very complex and not many people would look here, from people who are a bit older. If you think about it, in our present society relative to history, we're probably the first generation, maybe the second, that's thought it could live without elders. Almost all human communities always had elders. We have old people. It's very different. It's very, very different. And we don't listen to the voice of children really at all. The children are marginalized. Now, you can just extend that to say a lot of the leadership will also come from the economic periphery as well as the cultural periphery. So I think, I don't know what that means specifically, but I think that you just have to really watch, for example, for global youth movements around climate change, for example. I think that it's an issue that we're all kind of rolling the dice, frankly, because there's just enough uncertainty in any complex scientific field. Certainly this one is very complex, that anybody who says, well, they haven't proven it yet, can find plenty of evidence to convince others that they're right or convince themselves for starters. But, we're playing a great game of roulette with our kids' future, and the kids see it. Sooner or later, they're going to say, this is ridiculous. We can't sit around and wait forever for the adults to wake up and see just how fast the changes need to be. I mean, it's a perfect example of what I was saying before. We can all say, look, we've reduced our emissions 20%, 30%, 50%. So what? What if emissions globally need to fall 80% in the next 2 to 3 decades to avert disaster? Now, nobody can say that for sure, but we're not the ones who are going to suffer the consequence.
Yeah.
So you've got to look for that kind of new voice from a place it hasn't come from.
Knut, do you want to?
That's the one.
I'm sorry. Let me grab Knut for a follow-up, and then come back to you, Peter.
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to build on your expression, the voice of the voiceless, because I read this very clever survey done by Nike, where they first asked I think it was between 18 and 21-year-old youth what they thought about sustainability. And the general answer was they're not very engaged. That doesn't really motivate them. But then they asked, describe a better world, and they described sustainability precisely. And I think there's a lot of insight in that. There is a voice of the voiceless, and it has a lot to do with what we are discussing as sustainability.
Yeah. Peter,
if I could just make
and I don't think
Michael, there's such an important point. I don't want to lose it. Sustainability is just a label.
Yeah.
This is not about sustainability. This is about the future.
Yeah. Agreed. Peter, Graf, you wanted to follow up there?
So I wouldn't call them the voice of the voiceless. I would call them consumers. And yes. I think we're underestimating that element. And the media is doing a great favor to us all by continuing to report on environmental disasters and things that don't go right, albeit in a more sensationalistic way than maybe would be good at every point in time. But anyway, as soon as businesses find ways to credibly report on the impact on society and environment of products that people can buy, that's when we will have people voting with their wallet. Because as soon as you get somewhat close in terms of the price performance to established players with more sustainable products, that's swinging it towards the sustainable product.
Yeah.
And I think we are underestimating that. And I just hope that all the innovators in the consumer industry that we are working with, the Nestle's, the Danone, Nike, Unilever, all these companies, that they find a way to do that, because they can grab so much market share and make so much more money while actually preserving the planet and society. And that's, so I think consumers will play a huge role in making this successful. But it's the task of business to give consumers the information that's credible,
Right.
So they can make the right decision.
Right.
And I think that's why we joined the Sustainability Consortium, Peter, because that's exactly what we're trying to do there, right?
Yeah. We've only got a few minutes left, gentlemen, and I want to make sure that we hit an area that we had a lot of questions about. It's kind of the organization, cultural, how is my working life going to be different question. And some of it has to do with governance. You know, how do sustainability efforts get best led inside organizations and so forth. Fundamentally, it's a personal question for a lot of the viewers. Obviously, they're wondering, you know, how's my work life going to be different in an organization that's now going to have to respond to different kinds of threats and opportunities. But I'll begin with a question that's very direct. And obviously, Peter Graf, you're the perfect person to ask about this. Do companies need a chief sustainability officer?
Wow! If I only knew the answer to that question. I do believe sustainability is a fundamental transformation in business. That's what it triggers. Just like globalization triggered a fundamental change in how organizations operate, and yet we don't have a chief globalization officer in the company. But the point is that the going global doesn't initially require such a fundamental change management as sustainability does in the company. And I mean, we are driving a multi-year process to get people to even hear the message, understand the message, believe the message, act on the message, and then act on the message repetitively. And our CEO is just too busy doing a lot of great things in the area of sustainability and other areas that I think it's very good to have someone directly related to the CEO who brings the whole, management team together to execute and focus on this thing and have the patience to drive it through.
Yeah.
And I've had my argument in the Harvard Business Review with the CEO of Coca-Cola, who says we don't need one. I am the CSO. And I say, well, that's great. In essence, what you really want is you want executive involvement at the top. And then the way how you structure that doesn't really matter. But the CSO, more importantly, is it the CEO or the CSO? The organization is, you should never, ever organize yourself such that sustainability is outside the mainstream of your business. I have only 20 people reporting directly to me and more than 1,000 reporting to me indirectly. So it's a completely matrixed organization. There's a sustainability organization in operations. There's one in marketing, in sales, in development, in partner management, and they all report to me and into the line of business. And that's how we're we have a seat at the table at all these management, meetings. So when they talk about sales, the guy who runs sales for sustainability is at the table. And at the same time, we can manage it in an overarching way.
Yeah.
So do you need a CSO? I don't know, but you need someone who is strong, extremely well connected in the company to drive this with force, because it requires patience and it requires creativity to get the job done.
Let me come to you then, Peter Senge, and then to you, Knut, to identify, one thing perhaps about the way that organizations are going to function differently as a consequence of having to attack some different kinds of problems in different kinds of ways. How do you see organizations and cultures behaving differently in the years ahead as a consequence of these challenges?
Well, two things come to mind. One is very broad and fairly general, and the other fairly specific. It is all about awareness. Paul Pullman used an interesting phrase this morning when I was chatting with him. He's coming to MIT to do a big session on the 13th of May. It's kind of fitting, the 150th anniversary of MIT. We're going to have a session with Paul Pullman, the chairman of Unilever, and Barbara Stocking, the president of Oxfam GB, talking about how those two organizations have influenced each other over the last decade, which is fascinating story, just amazing. Because the civil society organizations need to evolve just as much as the global business organizations. They're both kind of tucked into kind of defensive niches to some degree, and they have to learn to work together. Paul said something very interesting. I thought it was such a nice phrase, but it was clearly very sincere. He mentioned, he said, businesses in the business as usual mindset have used society and environment in order to be successful. He said, in the future, we want society and environment to be successful in order to have a good business. It was just a simple turn of phrase, and obviously one that could be kind of a slick and stupid slogan if used wrong. But it was clear that that was his way of kind of getting at the essence of this shift in awareness. The way I've said it for years, our business as usual business models, what we've talked in business schools for years, basically exploit social and natural capital to produce productive and financial capital. Sooner or later, that whole one-way drain has got to be reversed. We have to see ourselves as building natural capital and building social capital. Now, a lot of companies would argue, well, they build social capital now, they educate a lot of people, but I think it's a much broader image you've got to take of the well-being of society. So that's the broad, kind of vague one. The other one, I think, is we really could start to think ahead towards when we just won't measure profit by itself. It just is a crazy limited measure. And the idea that it's the be-all and end-all, first off, it's already a simplification. Of course, in a lot of business, growth matters more than profitability, but we kind of oscillate between the two depending on the circumstances. But I heard a presentation also yesterday from Alan White, who is a founder of the Global Reporting Initiative. And of course, these are the folks who organized all the report writing, and Alan knows how critical I've been for years of CSR reports and all this other stuff, which fails on exactly the point that Peter Graf was just making, which is it isn't integrated. It isn't integrated into how you think about and manage the business at all levels. But that said, that's what they're working on now. They have a whole new second generation, which is about integrative reporting and an integrative set of metrics. And I gave the example of where the people at Unilever say there's really a difference in how we're managing today because our KPIs are actually integrative. Imagine that you just don't report profit anymore, ever, in isolation, but you report some sort of integrative indicator of your contribution to social, environmental, our natural, social, and financial capital. And you can't do one without the other. And by the way, what would go hand in glove with that, because I think it kind of has to be so as below, so above, GDP. GDP is an absolutely idiotic measure of social progress, and yet every political leader on the planet, doesn't matter what their governance system is. This is just as true for the premier and president of China as it is in the United States. Quake in their boots if their company doesn't, or their country doesn't perform as expected on GDP growth. And yet no one's ever seen a GDP. Very few of us can even explain how the damn thing is calculated. It's a totally artificial cultural phenomenon that we've all kind of bought into. So what does social well-being mean, and what does a healthy business mean in operational terms? What we measure and what are our primary metrics, I think will shift.
Great. Knut, I'm going to come to you, and because we're almost out of time, you're going to get the last word in answering this question. What's your view of the ways that organizations and cultures are most likely to be changing? The way we all live, work, and compete are going to be changing inside those organizations as a consequence of sustainability pressures over the next few years. What do you think?
Okay, so I'll answer it, but let me just first make a quick comment on your question on do we need CSOs? Peter said yes, and I agree. But CSOs they need a mandate, they need a commitment. And I think we see two camps. We see the CSOs with the real mandate, and we see those without. So I'd say yes to the CSO, but yes to the mandate. When it comes to the bigger changes, I would say that what we will see is companies breaking a few traditional trade-offs, and Peter Senge mentioned one of them. That's the trade-off profit and purpose. I think companies need to break this trade-off. The other one, I think, is growth and user resources. I think we will see companies growing without the increase in the user resources. And that's really what a Unilever is trying to do, and I applaud it. And finally, I would say that we will see braver moves. So we are looking together with the World Economic Forum at the sustainability champions from emerging economies. And what we see is a set of really brave companies transforming much more rapidly, setting much more ambitious targets, and I think we'll see more of it. And I think that's the way to break the trade-offs.
Great. Knut, thank you. We are out of time, so I just want to say, first of all, to each of you, Knut and Peter, thank you so much for joining us and having a terrific conversation. Thank you to all the viewers who came. I urge you to come to the sloanreview.com website where we can follow up and give you more reports, connect you to the other participants in the study and in this panel, and give you access to the panel after the fact. Thank you very much, and goodbye from the MIT Sloan Management Review.
Very welcome.
Thank you, and goodbye.
Thank you.